A protection against the tyranny of the majority, yes, but it is even more the assertion that no person's cause shall go unheard if some one person wishes to speak for it. Andrew Jackson is supposed to have said, "One man with courage is a majority." Well, not always in the Senate, but one man with determination, or one woman with determination, can alter the course of legislative history. Now that carries with it a great many shortfalls, and we'll discuss those as we go along. Among the shortfalls are the day-to-day inability of the Senate to move according to a predetermined course, gradually, if slowly, toward a desired end. There are many recommendations that you will hear here. One will be, shall there be electronic voting? I personally would happen to favor that. I think that anything that speeds up the course of events on the mechanical or logistical side is to be considered, and I certainly felt that television would. Whether or not the shortcomings of the Senate, the failure to satisfy the public urge for action, are affected by television remains to be seen. But I have a feeling that some of the ills which have befallen the legislative process can be corrected by public opinion, by the fact that not only C-SPAN, but the networks generally and the local stations constantly bring to the public's attention and awareness goings-on which hitherto would not have created much excitement. Take, for example, the filibuster. The attempt to put some limitations on the filibuster has occupied the Senate attention, especially at the beginning of each session, for many years. It is quite likely that the desire of the general public will be expressed through a greater awareness that the business of the country be proceeded with, perhaps with all deliberate speed, but that at the same time the right of that lone besieged individual shall continue to be preserved. We have discussed as we go along many of these things, such as germaneness and the improvement in the quality of life, why the Senate has night sessions. We'll probably discuss a game of legislative chicken, which is played between proponents and opponents here, and of course always at the expense of the other body. So it seems. I'm delighted to be here. I mustn't talk too long, but I do think that you'll get some insights here which will leave you better informed and better able to pass on to your students what you have heard. It's a privilege to be here.
Senator, thank you very much. And you never can talk too long. Anyone with as much sense of history and love of this institution as you have could never, ever speak too long. Now we'd like to go to Senator Eagleton, and particularly Senator Eagleton, as I say, is very seasoned, having spent almost 2 decades in the Senate, so knows its ins and outs very well. Particularly, we'd like for him to address some of the questions that seem to clog the machine. For instance, in the first session of the 99th, which we're just finishing, some 3 months out of the 12 months was spent calling the roll and quorum calls. We'd like for the Senator to go into how can that be avoided. Of course, some of it's necessary, we realize. The other procedures he's very familiar with. Senator Eagleton.
Thank you, Maury. First of all, I'm highly flattered, being the only Democrat here, and it takes 3 Republicans to offset me. And, I hope I'm up to the challenge. Secondly, I'm delighted to be part of any forum presented by the Strom Thurmond Institute. As I leave the United States Senate in a few weeks, I will carry many memories. And one of those memories will be of Senator Strom Thurmond, who, when the history of the United States Senate is ultimately written, if ever it be so, will be one of the big figures in that history. He is a fine gentleman. He and I do not always agree on each issue, but we get along very, very well, and I think we have a mutual respect and admiration for each other. I know it's on my side, and I hope it is on his side. I would suggest that the topic of this forum not be the Senate machine and how it works, but it should be the Senate machine and how it doesn't work. The Senate hit its peak in 1850 and has gone downhill since. In 1850, in the United States Senate, there was, for instance, James Calhoun of South Carolina. There was Daniel Webster. There was Henry Clay. There was Thomas Hart Benton of my own state of Missouri, later a profile in courage in John F. Kennedy's book. William Seward. Giants of their time, of intellect, of dedication, etc. And that was the peak of the United States Senate, and that's why it was once referred to as the greatest deliberative body on earth. I think that accolade belonged to the time of 1850. It most certainly does not belong to the time of 1986. The United States Senate is not, by any reasonable calculation or evaluation, the greatest deliberative body on earth. And I'll just tick off in sequence a few of the reasons and a tiny little cure or two, but I'll not elaborate because I think we'll do some elaboration as the discussion expands. Senator Scott has already mentioned the filibuster. We thought we had cured that back some years ago when we reduced the number of votes necessary to cut off debate from 67 to 60. It was thought, well, we could muster 60 votes and terminate this otherwise interminable debate. But a senator from Alabama, no longer amongst the living, discovered a loophole, just as tax lawyers discover loopholes in our rules, and invented what is called the post-cloture filibuster. And by that, you can run to the desk and file 5,000 amendments, whatever number you want. And even if 60 senators vote to cut off debate, you can start calling up these amendments one by one into perpetuity. And it's not only the utilization of that technique that slows down the Senate, but more importantly, it is the threat that a senator or two senators will utilize that technique that slows down the Senate. A senator or two may go up to the majority leader, in this instance now Senator Dole, and say, Senator Dole, if you call up Bill X, I just want to tell you, we're going to file 1,000 amendments at the desk. You can get cloture maybe after a week or 10 days of wrestling around, but then we've got all those amendments and we'll sink you. Dole says, as a practical person, well, yeah, you got my hands are tied. If you guys are going to do it, I'm done. That bill's dead, or that amendment's dead. That's the post-cloture filibuster. The non-germaneness matter. You can have a D.C. appropriation, District of Columbia appropriation bill on the floor, and you can offer an amendment on Contras in Nicaragua, if you're so minded. You can offer anything out of the Encyclopedia Britannica as an amendment to anything that's pending on the floor. That's ridiculous. I know of no other major legislative body, even the St. Louis Board of Aldermen doesn't permit that kind of shenanigan. Maybe we ought to consider having a Rules Committee in the Senate that has the same power as the Rules Committee in the House. I say maybe on that one. I'm convinced already about the filibuster rule. I'm convinced already about non-germaneness. I'd be willing to hear the debate on whether we ought to have a Senate Rules Committee. We have one in the Budget Reform Act, but it's been a halting and faltering step, and we're not by any means all the way home on a really workable budget process. And then, I conclude, the most important of all, money. Ladies and gentlemen, this building has the stench of money. The Capitol building has the stench of money. The three House office buildings have the stench of money. And money has its pervasive and evil influence on this process in a whole host of ways. One, it takes up an extraordinary amount of the senator's time to try to raise it. When I came here in 68, you could raise enough money in the 6th year of your term And you didn't even have to start on January of the 6th year. You could maybe start around March and raise an adequate amount of money for your campaign. I now know of senators who start in year 1 of their 6 years, and then in their final 2 or 3 years devote 3/4 and even more of their time to fundraising, thinking about it, planning it, executing it, losing sleep over it. That's wrong. That's wrong. And then the influence that the money has. The PACs are just the tip of the iceberg. It's the most notorious tip of the iceberg. It is by no means the total story. The influence that money has in the predetermination of a senator's position or opinion. Let me give one example and I'll be through. Suppose I had run for re-election in 1986, and suppose the tobacco lobby, and I just pick out one, I could pick any group. I could take the AFL-CIO, I could take the truckers, I could take the chamber, I could take the pharmaceutical industry. But suppose the tobacco people came to me and said, we're interested, Senator, in contributing to your campaign. I'd be stunned if they did, but suppose they came in, and we'd like to contribute $10,000. I would know if I took that $10,000 what the tobacco folks were interested in, indeed what they wanted. I know what kind of support programs they want for tobacco growers. I know what kind of labeling they don't want on packages of cigarettes, et cetera. I know their agenda. So if I take the $10,000, I'm hitched to that agenda. Or I'm an ingrate, or whatever you want to call it. So I'm predetermined just by the receipt of that $10,000. I've signed on board, not in writing, not in a contract, not even a handshake, just by the mere fact that I've received a hefty contribution from an interest group, and I know what their agenda is and what they expect. These folks around here that are handing out this money are not giving it to the little sisters of the poor. This is not an exercise in the American Red Cross. This is not an exercise in national philanthropy. Folks that are handing out 5s and 10,000s, and then they can aggregate them and bump